Here to talk to you today about climate risk, securing your supply chain from physical climate risk. There's an economic study that said that as a prisoner, you are more likely to get parole if you see the judge right after lunch than right before. So I'm hoping that everyone's in a good mood right now, even though I pulled you away from that delicious food and conversation. So I'm going to start here today with a question. I got 2 questions on Slido, so I'm told you're all experts at this by now. If you log into Slido and go type in GTW 2022 as your password. Just curious, where are you all at with the climate change conversation and understanding physical climate change in particular? Okay, can't see from over here. All right, they're coming in live. All right, well, glad to see there's a lot of folks who are planning to get to this. And the second question then, right, are you taking action? So potentially if you're only thinking about it, maybe this one will be a little more boring, but we'll see. Yeah, so we're in an uncomfortable place, right? You're starting to hear that something is required, but you haven't started to do it yet. And so I'm here today to help you start that journey and give you some tips on what to look out for as you're thinking about understanding climate change risk. So thank you for participating. All right, so we'll launch into it. So my background is in natural disaster risk management. I worked for RMS for the majority of my career, thinking about present-day natural disasters. And now I'm thinking about future disasters over at Jupiter Intelligence. So quick background on Jupiter. So we're about 5 years old. We take the world's best climate science from institutions and global climate models around the world, and we operationalize them. My job at Jupiter is to slice and dice climate models and turn them into useful metrics that we can use to map them to economic impacts. So we model 8 different perils all over the world, and we do this for a variety of sectors. So we have the finance side, who's more interested in how should climate change affect my mortgage risk? And then we also work directly with corporates who are trying to understand their physical climate risk around the world. Now, climate risk is a journey, and we help get different firms further along this spectrum from the beginning, where it's not a priority. Doesn't seem like many people are in that category right here, to starting out that, you know what, I need to do something about this. And you might start looking at climate risk vendors and trying to understand what's out there. And as you move forward through here, you start analyzing that data, working it into your day-to-day, until ideally climate becomes a normal part of your business operations. That you have climate risk folded into ERM framework, that you're thinking about climate risk when you are making your investment decisions and resiliency decisions. All right, so at Jupiter, I manage this product, Climate Score Global. This is a tool to model your climate risk anywhere on the land surface of the planet. We model 8 different perils and help you understand what your climate risk was in the past, what is it today, and how is that changing in the future. And also how that's changing under multiple possible futures. So we have a choice here today to take on a lot of transition risk by committing to Paris and keeping warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Or we can not do that and have much lower transition risk, but then be punished by having a large amount of physical risk. So those are those climate scenarios that you see there. So you have the 2.6 scenario that maps to 1.8 degrees of warming by the end of the century. That's what's ideal. Then you have what's most likely in the middle, most likely as deemed by the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. And then you have RCP 8.5, which is, all right, we're not doing anything about it. We don't have to worry about net zero commitments, but then this is the warming and the world that we're faced with. So at Jupiter, we're modeling this for many different time steps, from the past all the way out to 2100, worldwide at a 90-meter resolution. And our customers use this to understand the risks they're going to face and the time horizons that they're facing them on. Now, because I spend a lot of time in the climate space, it's a really rapidly growing space. A lot of these companies didn't exist 5 years ago, including my own. And they're growing really fast. There's a lot of data out there. So how can you identify climate data that's going to be useful for what you're trying to do? So the first thing here, decision useful metrics. So if you have a factory that when it's above a certain temperature, your equipment can't run as efficiently, then you need to understand the exact frequency that that's going to happen in the future and how that's going to change over time. If you just have a vague average temperature metric, that's not going to directly map to your financial impact. So spending time thinking about what are the causes of loss at your facilities, and then figure out the metrics that are going to power that. So that's all I spend my time doing, right, is how can I slice up this climate model to figure out what's going on here? So second, the latest science. So climate science is moving very quickly, not just because it's an interesting priority for the entire world, but also because cloud computing has democratized who can generate their own climate models and run them on the cloud. You don't need to work at a national lab to get access to their supercomputer anymore. You see a lot more smaller groups spinning up their own climate science and climate models, and then contributing that to the academic community. So it's really important to work with data that's based on the newest climate science. And I want to specifically call out tropical cyclones here, right? I know there are lots of factories in Southeast Asia in particular that are churning out goods that are important to the rest of the economy. So climate models themselves don't do a good job of modeling tropical cyclones. There aren't enough simulations of the future to thoroughly blanket the world's coastlines with all the possible tropical cyclones that could happen. So instead, a climate data provider needs to look to different approaches. So for us, we simulate hundreds of thousands of tropical cyclones over the world, and then we change their characteristics in time based on sea surface temperatures and other climate indicators. That helps us get a forward-looking view of how climate is going to change, how sea level rise is going to impact storm surge, and so forth. The next tool I'll take together, so transparent methods. Is your climate data provider using methods that are cited? How open are they? Or are they just giving you a score but not telling you what is driving that score? Quantified uncertainty goes along with that, being able to understand the wide uncertainty in climate modeling. It's different for different perils, it's different for different regions, and it's certainly much larger as we move forward in time. So knowing what those bounds are really helps you make more useful decisions. And finally, having flexibility in the scenarios that you're able to use and the time horizons that are available to you is very important. So I talked earlier about the different scenarios that are out there for the world. So if you are disclosing something for your regulators, maybe you'll choose the optimistic scenario. But if internally you're thinking about your stress tests, maybe you'll choose the more pessimistic scenario and manage to that. Same thing with time horizons. So your assets have different expected usable lifetimes. Some you might be planning to phase out in the next 5 or 10 years, but you might have a critical port that you expect to be using for the next 50 years. So matching the time horizon to your assets is going to help you have a much more thorough and better climate analysis. All right, so I have a lot of soapboxes that I get on when it comes to climate, so those are my favorites. So now I'll actually show you what you can do with this data. All right, so I'm going to take you through a supply chain analysis. This is done with Jupyter's data, and we use Tableau dashboards to visualize it because that helps us quickly create dashboards customized to our users' different needs. So I'm going to look at four different apparel providers. This is the main dashboard that we see. In the middle there, we have the number of locations that are exposed to different levels of heat, extreme rain, and wind, and so forth. On the left, I have some switches that I can play around with. So here I'm looking at the worst case scenario, the RCP 8.51. I'm looking at 2020 exposure, and I'm looking at all of these four brands together. As I move forward in time to 2030, and we'll show 2050, I can see the exposure to different critical levels changing. So in this case, a warming atmosphere can hold more rain. That leads to more and stronger precipitation events. And it's obviously getting warmer, right? Global warming is not called it for a reason. And then I can look at just Patagonia in this case, and I see that they're disproportionately affected by heat and precipitation. And I also want to call out flood here, right? Flood is one of those perils that if it hits you, it doesn't take very much to knock out a warehouse or a critical facility for a long time. So flood is one of those really present things that with sea level rise is growing a lot in the future. So looking at Patagonia then, I'm going to zoom in on the individual assets that Patagonia has. And now I'm looking at flooding, the 1 in 100 year probability. So 1 in 100 years means that in any typical year, there's about a 1% chance that this event is going to happen. Now, over the lifetime of 30 years, there's about a 26% chance that it's going to happen, right? So it might seem very distant, but a 26% chance in the next 30 years, that starts to become more real and more realistic to be thinking about this as a number to manage to. So right here, I'm looking at flood risk. I see their properties in the Americas are looking all right, but Southeast Asia is looking a little more questionable. So zooming into there a bit, I can now see that I have a handful of assets that might have 2 meters of flooding or more, right? 2 meters is enough to knock out a facility for a considerable length of time. So that's an initial run through of what are the risks I'm worried about for Patagonia. I can also look at the individual locations and look at the raw metrics underneath. So one of my soapboxes is not just looking at the high level, but also looking at underneath, peeling back the onion, what is the actual data going on here? So this is looking at heat, look at the number of days per year that I'm going to have a temperature of 38 C or higher. We'll say that that's a risky point where equipment has to run more slowly, your workers might be having to work more slowly, and so you can see how this is changing over time, with that top location in India having 57 days in 2020 above that temperature threshold, and 74 days at that threshold just in the next 30 years. Right? So this is where we're hitting these critical thresholds. Zooming in on an individual location, I'm going to take one of these, and now we can visualize it on a map. And the bottom half of the screen is showing me a snippet of the 7,000 metrics that we actually have. No one needs 7,000, of course, but you can pick and choose the scenarios and the years and the metrics that make the most sense to you. So here I've got flooding, I have water stress metrics, extreme precipitation, heat and fire, and so forth. So zooming in on this location, I can see that it's close to the water, not right up against it, but certainly something I should be worried about. What we often do with our users is that for the first round, we'll take 1 point at each location, and then for a second analysis, we'll go through and we'll scatter the points across it to give you a blanket and a mesh, so you can understand the different parts of that facility that might have more or less risk. So looking at flood here, I had 1.75 meters of water that I can expect once every 100 years, and that grows to 2.15 meters by 2050. I can then turn that into financial loss, right? What does 1.75 meters do to me? Well, in this case, my building would be damaged 27%, and my inventory would be damaged 64%. So that translates to a significant financial loss for me, tens of millions of dollars, if this event were to happen. I can also look at my average annual loss, which is what's going to drive my insurance premium, and that's $500,000 now, but it's growing over time. So just one example of using climate data to project your future flood risk, understand how your insurance or costs are going to change, understand how the downtime at that facility is going to change. That helps you prepare for the future. All right, so now I'm going to talk about scoring. So scoring can be a really helpful way to understand the story of what's going on with your data. At Jupiter, we think about this on a 2-axis scale. So on the x-axis here, we have our present-day level of hazard. On the y-axis, we have how quickly that's going to change in the future. We do it this way because, frankly, I got into an argument with a colleague 2 years ago about whether it was relative change that mattered or absolute change, and how do you think about climate risk and what actually makes something risky? Well, it is these two dimensions working together. And so having this in quadrants lets us tell different stories. So the bottom left is low risk now, staying low. Top right, high risk now, staying high in the future. Then the corners get really interesting. The bottom right means that I have high risk now, but it's not changing very quickly in the future. So it's likely that I already have adaptation measures in place to be able to deal with this climate risk. The top left, though, gets a bit worrisome. This means I have low risk today, but relative to me, it's changing very quickly in the future. So that's where shocks can happen. That's where surprises happen. So from a heat risk perspective, I look back to Seattle last summer that had a heat wave that was tens of degrees higher than they were ever used to. Air conditioning is not common in Seattle. They don't usually need it, but they're going to need it a lot more in the future. It's going to be much more disruptive for them to adapt to just a few degree change into these dangerous areas than it will be for LA to adapt to it, where everyone already has air conditioning. So looking a bit further then into climate scores, I had the individual companies up there, but now I'm looking at each country, right? So congratulations, in the UK, you're looking pretty good. Good time to invest in the UK wine scene. I think France is going to get a little bit hotter in the future. So UK is looking great. Cambodia, Vietnam, right? Combination of tropical cyclones and high heat and winds and precipitation. That's where we start to see a little more dangerous activity. So I can compare my suppliers in each country, and I can also divide this by supplier types. So if I have the occupancies for each one of them, in this case, I might see that my plastic supplier, my shoelace supplier, they're at much higher risk than a tannery that I have. Potentially that's in the UK. And then I can look at all my suppliers individually, right? Hover over these dots in an interactive way to be able to drill into, right? So with these metrics and the right way of thinking about them and how they're moving and changing over time, I can identify and quantify the expected impact of each peril. For my supply chains, I can now take action. I might need to move them. I might try to remove them. I might duplicate them if I'm worried about one part of my supply chain being knocked offline by an extreme flood. I can also prioritize my investment. So maybe I want to invest in one area, improve its resiliency, put up flood walls, elevate how I'm storing my goods. At other places, maybe it's time to take a step back. The goal here, though, is to predict the changes that are happening. Climate data is out there, and if you get the right data, you can use it to predict what's going to happen and avoid surprises. So I've got about 3 minutes for questions. And I'm going to try to make this work. We'll see. No questions asked yet. Yes?
Apologies, I missed the start, but how long have you been running for, and have any of your predictions come true from the data you have?
Yeah. Well, so it's a really good question. So our company is about 5 years old, ancient in climate data terms, at least. So what we can do is after an event happens, for a verification validation process, we go through and predict how does this floodplain look compared to what we had. So for the Germany and Luxembourg or Belgium floods last summer, we're able to overlay our data with that and map out, do we have our waters going in the same way? And it's looking pretty good. Yeah.
You talked about the example for time horizons. It could be 5 months, but it could be 50 years if my asset is a port. How do you come up with those really? With weather forecasting, it's hard to predict 5 days in advance. How do you predict 50 years in advance for the purpose of this analysis?
Sure. All right, so the question, if you didn't hear, was how do you predict 50 years, right? How valid is it that I'm talking about 50 years in the future? So we try to take our data from the very best and as many global climate models as we can. So these climate models are released by institutions all over the world who are pouring all the knowledge from all their scientists into those global climate models. And we don't just take one climate model, we take as many as we can, because there's a lot of other variations, and they all have strengths and weaknesses to them. So we take as many as we can to make it more likely that we're converging to the scientific consensus. And we also debias the data. So climate models don't just run from today into the future. They also look at the past. And so you can compare how well they did at modeling the past with what actually happened. And maybe you see that they're underestimating heat risk in France. Or maybe the strength of the Indian monsoon season is a little too low given what they're modeling. So you can identify bias in the past and then apply that to the future. Because they all have problems, yes, but if you debias them, then you can still use them as a credible estimate of the future. Yes?
Are you able, with the data that you have access to, are you able to help, I guess, quantify the likelihood of shocks? So, like really, you mentioned a much higher heat wave, most of the floods in Germany. Is there a way to, I guess, quantify the likelihood of propensity to shocks, or will they always remain shocks? And if so, can you deal with that?
Yeah, great. So the general question was, are you able to predict these shocks, right? How am I supposed to predict something that's supposed to surprise me, right? So I think that there certainly is an element of black swan, gray swan, white swan when it comes to climate risk. And what we're trying to do is shift things from black swan, which the unknown unknowns, right? You weren't even thinking about it, at least into the gray territory, where we can start thinking about, okay, you will hit these temperatures, right? So one of the heat thresholds we have, it's a combination of heat and humidity, and it's looking at what point do you have to go inside because it's dangerous to be outside. That's something that you may never think about because it's so rare in the world today, but we can actually slice off that exact threshold and predict that for the future. And I'm at 0,
Yes.
so I'm going to stop talking. Thank you for your questions, though. I'll be around later. It's great talking to you all.